Well, hello, Clairlea Park Church. My name is Joel Sherbino, and I'm a pastor at a Presbyterian church in Paris, Ontario, about an hour west of Toronto. But then in addition to that, I work 25% with international ministries within our denomination with our partners in Malawi. Specifically, I focus my work upon working with prisoners in the southern part of Malawi. And so I am so thankful for opportunities such as this to come and to share a little bit more about some of the work that our church is doing internationally, but also to be able to potentially plant some seeds that maybe as individuals or as a congregation, you would like to take that next step and see how can you partner with this ministry that we're involved in Malawi as well. I realize being in person would have been great, and hopefully that will happen down the road, a chance to meet some of you and to chat a little bit more. But I am so grateful for opportunities like this, that even though I'm hanging out in my office in Paris and you're hanging out in your home, in the kitchen, in the living room, downstairs, wherever it may be, that we can continue to connect like this. And so as we get rolling here today, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been forgotten? Lost, or maybe left behind? I'm sure we've all had those moments in our lives, and they often bring a certain amount of stress and worry and anxiety, don't they? A number of instances I could think back to in my own life, but one that particularly comes to mind is when I was about 5 years old. We were at camp together as a family, and one of the ways that they ran meals at this camp was for all the campers, regardless of age, to line up before you entered into the dining hall. And so as a 5-year-old, I typically got distracted and wasn't paying attention to where we were to line up, or where more particularly my family was. Well, when I had finished doing whatever I was previously doing and looked up, I realized my family was nowhere to be found. Well, as a 5-year-old, panic begins to set in. But I had a plan, I had an idea. I would go through the crowd looking at the legs until I could find a pair of legs that I could identify as my dad's. Well, the plan seemed to work. I was scurrying in and out of legs, and suddenly I saw a pair of legs that were definitely my dad's. And so I ran, I was excited, I was joyful, and I wrapped my arms around those legs until I looked up and noticed and realized the head was not the same as I thought in the legs. Completely different guy. Well, they kind of had a laugh, and my family was only a couple rows over, and so they brought me to my dad and to my family. But I'm sure we've all had those moments where we have been forgotten, where we've been left behind, and worry begins to set in. And now that I'm a dad, I can relate to that sense I had as a 5-year-old. When my kids were young, oftentimes at night when they would be going to bed, they would always want the door left open a crack. And then even after they had sort of settled and we had gone into the other room to read or watch TV or clean up, surely one of them would often call out, "Mom, Dad, are you still there?" And if they weren't quite sure, if we didn't respond immediately, they would sneak out of the room, look around the corner just to make sure we were still there. I'm sure we all have those moments, those times either in our past or maybe in our present where we have been forgotten, we have been left behind, and there's a sense of worry, there's a sense of stress that certainly comes along with it. Over the last number of years, I have become more and more involved in the work in the prisons in Malawi. I lived in Malawi from 2004 until 2007 with my family, and then we returned for 1 year for 2015 and then in 2016. And I am so blessed and so fortunate to be able to kind of combine my ministry here in Paris and my ministry in Malawi as well. Now, Malawi, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that country. It's in the southern part of the country. It's a very small country. 80% of Malawians are subsistence farmers, which means they are incredibly dependent upon the crops. Year to year, there is often the concern as to whether or not they would have enough. Malawi is one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world. It's a country that struggles with malaria, with HIV and AIDS, with climate, with lack of education, with significant amounts of poverty. I'm sure you start to get the picture. Well, the circumstances and the situation in the prisons are unfortunately even worse. Prisons are typically overcrowded and underfunded. They are lacking the basic necessities that I know in my life I so often take for granted, like food, medicine, clean water, proper sanitation. They're incredibly overcrowded. The size of this cell, like imagine your living room, probably comfortable for 8 to 10 people, but typically in Malawi, if that was the size of a cell, there would be 30 to 40 men crammed into that place. They are locked into their cell at about 4 o'clock at night and then not released until about 6 a.m. in the morning. Only a small slit at the very top allowing light to come in. They faced with incredible and harsh conditions. I remember thinking back to my time in 2015. At the end of one of our Bible studies in Chichiri prison in Blantyre, at the end we wanted to have a time of prayer. And so I asked very openly to a group of men, about 120, if there was anything specifically that we could pray for. In my mind, I was already kind of making up the list. That they would be released, that there'd be enough food, that they would be healed from whatever sickness or ailment they may have. And yes, those were requests that came. But I was stopped in my tracks when I heard over and over again these men asking that they would not be forgotten. You see, this was a request that didn't just simply come once. Almost every time we visit the prisons, the number one prayer is that they would be remembered, that they would not be forgotten. You see, for many of them, they feel as if they have been forgotten by their country. In Malawi, justice is fairly punitive, that they put you away, they lock you up, and they don't think about you anymore. There's a lack of resources. There's a lack of finances that go towards them. And so many of these men and women in prisons feel as if their country has forgotten them. But then there's the next step. For many of them, they feel as if their family has forgotten them. Some of the families are ashamed that their loved ones are in prison, and so they have nothing to do with them. In other circumstances, the family lives so far away they cannot afford to get there. Or in many circumstances, because inmates are transferred around so often, they don't even know where their loved ones are. And so they feel as if they too have been forgotten by family. And then it's not much of a step for them to land at the place of thinking that perhaps they too have been forgotten by God. I know our circumstances are not anywhere close to what these men and women face in the prisons. But I think sometimes we may carry the same reality. That oftentimes, based upon the circumstances or the situations we find ourselves in, that we begin to believe that because of what is happening to us, that there is no way that God could possibly be with us. And so as I think of our circumstances, as I think of the situation of the men and women in these prisons in Malawi, being forgotten is a real good place to start. Now, I'm sure you perhaps were a little bit thrown by the New Testament reading here today. In Matthew's account, where we hear the story of the name given to Jesus. The message that the angel gave to Joseph of not only how he was to marry Mary, but also to give him the name Emmanuel. It's an amazing message that we celebrate at Christmas, but hopefully it is more than that. Hopefully it is a reminder that we live in the midst of all of life. These incredible words, these incredible reminder that Emmanuel, God with us. It's a reminder that in Jesus, we are not forgotten. That regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the situation, we can know and be confident that God is truly with us. As you start to read through the Bible, you start to realize how familiar this theme truly is, of God remembering his people, of God being with his people. Perhaps one of the most well-known Psalms is Psalm 23, something we also just read. And it's another great reminder of God's promise and presence, that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the author says, I will not be afraid, for you, O Lord, are with me. Such a great reminder for all of us in the midst of life. Or if we jump to the end of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 28, following Jesus' resurrection, and then as he is ascending, he reminds his disciples. He gives them these final words. And I don't know about you, but anytime someone is leaving, anytime someone is going away, you really kind of lock into what they say at the very end. And I love how Jesus says, and remember, I am with you always. That's what I so appreciate about the Gospel of Matthew, is how he bookends it in reminding us of God's constant presence with us. I think this is a message that we all need to hear, whether we live in Toronto, in Paris, or in Malawi. Particularly this past year, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of the challenges, in the midst of all the difficulties. I understand, and I don't want to diminish any of one's challenges and the difficulties they have faced. Perhaps for many of you, this is a year unlike any year where you have felt alone. You have felt forgotten. And perhaps today is the day that we all need to be reminded of God's presence with us. I think one of the great lessons that we learn through the teachings of Jesus, through the reality of the Bible, is that the gift of God's presence doesn't always change our present circumstances, but it can certainly give us a new perspective. When Jesus says, I will be with you always to the very end of this age, is not a promise that there'll be no more difficulties, that there'll be no more hardships, there'll be no more moments where it seems like you may be on your own. But it's here that we hold on to. We cling to the promise that God is with us. Reminded again of these words in Psalm 23. That as David is reciting these words, he's still having to go through the valley of the shadow of death, but he finds peace, he finds confidence in knowing that he is not walking alone. This is a message that we often share with the men and the women in the prisons in Malawi. That although their circumstances may not change, that they would continue to know, continue to hold to the wonderful hope that they have in Jesus, in knowing that he is with them, that he has not forgotten them, that he will never forsake them. Perhaps the same is true for you in your circumstance, in your situation. That this is not something that suddenly changes everything. It's not as if COVID goes away overnight. Your circumstance and your challenges don't just suddenly get sorted because you believe in Jesus, but hopefully it changes your perspective. It reminds you that in the midst of whatever you are facing, whatever your valley is that you are going through, that you can know that God is with you. Thinking back to my kids when they are alone in their room, perhaps scared by the dark. You know, them calling out or me going in their room and just sitting with them for a moment. It doesn't change their circumstance. It's still dark in their room. They still need to close their eyes and go to sleep. But what brings them a sense of calm and peace is knowing the presence of their dad is with them. I think that's so fitting for us as well as we think of our own lives, of just knowing the presence of God with us. It's the presence of Jesus, this gift that was given first at Christmas, but hopefully lives every day of our lives, is the hope that gives us the ability to continue to trust, to continue to move forward in the midst of whatever we are facing in life. And so the prison ministry in Malawi, that is ultimately what it is all about. It is about planting seeds of hope, of reminding these men and women who are in incredibly difficult circumstances that God has not forgotten them. And so through dedicated volunteers, Rami, Hastings, and Leica, they are our big three on the ground in Malawi. They are quite literally the hands and feet of this ministry. We are able to be present in the lives of some of the men and women in these prisons, in some of the most difficult places in Malawi. And so we plant seeds of hope in two primary ways. The first one is through weekly Bible studies. Currently, we are visiting 17 prisons. That's 12 male prisons and 5 female prisons. It adds up to about 2,800 inmates. And it's there that we provide Bible study, a one-on-one counseling and prayer, a weekly reminder that God is with them. Now, COVID has presented its challenges. We have not been able to freely go into the prisons as often as we would wish. And so we've adapted a little bit. And what we're now doing is we are writing Bible studies for the prisoners that we then go and we give to them, and we may teach one or two of them, and then they then deliver to the others in the prisons as well. And so that although we can't be with them, just this simple act of showing up week by week reminds them that they are not forgotten. The second area of planting seeds of hope primarily is through monthly distribution. Every month we go to these 17 prisons and we distribute these basic necessities such as soap, medicine, clothing, food, bed mats, proper footwear, bowls for them to put their food into, whatever is needed within the specific prisons. And it's so amazing to hear the impact that is being had. And so how do we respond as we hear these words, as we think about our own circumstance? May I suggest a couple of things. The first one is to not allow these words simply to be words we hear, but to live this hope. That in whatever you are facing today, may you know that you are not alone, that you are not forgotten. The words of Jesus, I will be with you always. The announcement of his birth, Emmanuel, reminding us God is with us. And so how do we begin to live this hope so that although our circumstances may not change, our perspective most certainly will? The second thing is, how can we begin to share this hope with others? Perhaps you know some people who are feeling alone, who perhaps are feeling as if they too have been forgotten. Someone who's struggling, someone who's in a hard place. How can you reach out to them? Simply provide what Henry Nouwen often speaks of as the ministry of presence. It's not so often the words we speak, but simply being there for someone else. Maybe give them a call. Show up and stand at a distance and just let them know that they are not forgotten. This is ultimately what we do with our ministry in Malawi. Perhaps the next step for you as well would be considering how can you further partner with the work that we are doing in Malawi with the men and women in prisons. I would suggest that perhaps you could begin to pray for them. Pray for our volunteers, that they would have strength, that they would have wisdom, that they would continue to bring the sense of peace into some of these difficult and dark places. Pray for the men and women that are in prison, that they too would know the hope that comes through knowing Jesus, that they would find hope and strength in him. A second way is, of course, financially. All of the ministry on the ground is provided through generous contributions through congregations or individuals, helping us to provide transportation as many of these prisons are at a distance, and our volunteers need public transit in order to get there. Financial contributions also helps to buy the basic necessities that we provide every month. Every little bit helps, and it's amazing what happens when we continue to come together. And then the third way is stay connected. Hopefully this is one step in many steps as we continue in this journey together, partnering, planting seeds of change. Kevin, as your minister, has been just a tremendous support to me, and I am so grateful for him, as I'm sure you are for him as well. If you touch base with Kevin, I send out a monthly email update. Happy to include you on that. We have a Facebook page. If you simply search Friends of Prisons Malawi, it will appear. But let's stay connected. Let's be reminded together that we are not alone, that we have the hope of Jesus in the midst of all of life. And as we partner together, we can plant seeds of hope in the prisons in Malawi. Thank you again for this opportunity, and may you have a wonderful rest of your day.